David Glenn, I'm the acting chairman or chairperson for the Transit Advisory Committee. And the reason I'm here today is because our previous chairman, Robert Bronte, resigned due to medical reasons. I'm here today to talk about at our recent meeting we showed up and there was an attempt really to eliminate our Transit Advisory Committee. And it was really done without our approval, our input, or our consent from the community. The Transit Advisory Committee, you know, serves at the pleasure of the board of directors here. You created us, and changes to that Transit Advisory Committee per our bylaws are that they can only be changed by the board of directors or by the Transit Advisory Committee with the approval of the board of directors. After our meeting, I did get a chance to meet with Brad Miller to talk about what the plan was to create 2 new committees relative to the Greenligh Health Initiative. After our discussion, we talked about there was going to be 2 different committees. One was ridership-based and one was business-based. And these would, of course, have an emphasis on the Greenligh Health Initiative. From that discussion, we feel that the Transit Advisory Committee can fill that one aspect of it for the ridership committee, and that there only needs to be one additional committee for the business type for the Greenligh Initiative that needs to be created, not start all over again with both of them. To make it successful, though, I think more input is needed from the board of directors, especially where our new members are concerned. You know, in our bylaws, all the board of directors are supposed to recommend people to the Transit Advisory Committee. And over the last couple of years that I've been involved with it, there really has been a lot of involvement and not a lot of new people put forward. Commissioner Brickfield, he took a big initiative that he put a lot of people towards the Transit Advisory Committee, but not a lot from everywhere else, and that's why our sort of numbers have been dwindling in the Transit Advisory Committee. And we'd like to take a more proactive approach with everything. You know, we really want to be more interactive involvement, you know, with the board of directors coming here and talking to you in front of you. A lot of the recommendations that we're making, I don't know if the information is really making it to you, but especially with the Greenligh Health Initiative, you know, we want to be more proactive with that and be more involved with it. But it takes a little bit more involvement from PSTA as well to sort of focus our attention and what we need to be discussing and bring those recommendations to the board on a more regular basis. So we hope to take this into consideration. From my understanding, you have some workshops coming up that you might be discussing this. So if you look at that and keep the Transit Advisory Committee, because we don't want it to end, we just want to become more involved in what's going on, especially with the improvements to public transportation that are coming up. Thank you.
Brad, do you want to respond to that briefly?
Yeah. As Mr. Glenn, he is the current chair of our current Transit Advisory Committee of Citizens, stated, we do have a initiative to reconstitute the citizen advisory role at PSTA from one committee into possibly 2 committees. And that item does need some board input because that hasn't been presented yet. It's on the agenda for the PSTA Legislative Committee to review, which is immediately following this meeting, after this meeting ends. So hope maybe you can stay for that or participate. But the idea is essentially to not necessarily just add a committee to the existing Transit Advisory Committee, but to make it more productive and really more input from the citizens to the actions of PSTA. And that's the whole goal of the initiative. And I think David and I agree on that.
Yes. Okay.
So stay tuned for the Legislative Committee, and hopefully you can stay and hang around for them.
Okay. Any other speakers today? Okay. What we're going to do then is go on to the Greenligh Financial Plan presented by Mr. Miller.
In the spirit of Greenligh, it's always important to hear from the citizens, so that was a very important mediation we had. So as you know, we are moving very quickly right along this path that we laid out probably about 8 months ago, or maybe some might say 40 years ago. But we have completed a very intense level, and we're continuing with public involvement along the way. We and out of that effort, we created 2 Greenligh committees, one of civic leaders, which continue to reach out, and we plan to continue that group reaching out more and more to civic organizations around the county about the Greenligh Pinellas Plan, and a business group, the Greenligh Business Committee, which was about 45 business executives and Chamber of Commerce leaders from around the county. And not entirely through their suggestion, but they are certainly, they were the catalyst for suggesting that we develop a detailed financial plan, and that we check and recheck all of our financial assumptions and numbers that we have put together under the alternative analysis. And so that's what you're going to hear this morning from the consultants that we have hired. First, from HNTB, which is an engineering firm, that their task was specifically to review the 2011 alternative analysis cost estimate that was done by Jacobs Engineering on the proposed rail system. So Jacobs Engineering in 2011 developed as many of you remember, developed a financial plan and a cost estimate for the proposed rail line. And what HNTB now has looked at all those assumptions, made changes, and the punchline I'm happy to report is they're coming back with a number that validates that number fairly closely. Then Ernst & Young, who you're going to hear from, they had a different task. They were set to expand on what Jacobs had done in 2011 and look at a sustainable financial plan out into the future, out to 2050, a 35-year financial, a way that we can sustain this Greenligh plan out into, for the long term. And they're going to make some recommendations. Ultimately, this is an informational item for you today. Again, your next meeting, we want to make sure that you get this information and get all your questions answered today, because your next meeting on November 20th as a full PSTA board will be the meeting when the board is asked to approve the Greenligh Pinellas plan. To approve the plan. You have taken interim steps to approve the bus and the rail and the station area design concepts, and then this is the financial piece that shows how this can be sustained over the long haul. That's your major vote coming up next month. Additional votes that will be coming down the pipe out of this financial work are changes to our financial policies here at PSTA. They're going to make some recommendations on those, and then you'll see those coming through the Finance Committee and ultimately here. So with that, let me introduce Ben Walker with HNTB to walk through the first part of the presentation.
Great, thank you. Again, my name is Ben Walker with HNTB. Happy to be with you this morning to talk about our results and really the detailed analysis to those capital cost components for the light rail system. HNTB and one of our sub-consultants, Ernst & Young, really have worked hand in hand in feeding each other that information that's most important. So our information that we develop on that rail capital cost is fed into that financial model that Ernst & Young developed. When we talk about the capital cost estimate review from the Jacobs alternative analysis, we really went into that fine detail tuning, looking at very specific line items that would be associated with the actual construction of the light rail system, such as your track costs and the differences in track costs, whether they be at grade or in street running, like in the downtown areas, or elevated sections when you're having a crossover busy intersections. We also looked at area station concepts and costs, the maintenance facilities that would be associated primarily with light rail transit and the storage of those vehicles overnight. So supporting roadways, because once you integrate your light rail into in-street running, you'll have some associated roadway costs. So it's really a very comprehensive analysis of all costs associated with procuring a light rail system. Most importantly, we also looked at your systems and made some assumptions on going forward on how this light rail system would operate and how that's going to affect your capital costs, such as the signals that will be required not only for signals at the roadways, but signals for train operations as well. The power associated with whether you're running at a single track or areas where you have passing and dual track locations, because those also have an effect on those capital costs. The communications and fare collection, again, how the trains are communicating to each other for improved safety, whether it's operator line of sight or whether a more GIS-based system. And of course, your transit vehicles and those professional services that would be involved in developing the system for the engineering, your right-of-way support, construction, and of course, construction inspection. So once we looked at all those different capital cost components on a very line-by-line item, we also looked at the contingency. And at this stage in the planning process, because we were so early and haven't undergone that final design, we wanted to be very conservative with those contingencies amount. So each line item had an associated contingency, some more than others, based on how that, whether it's a very industry standard item or very specific to this location, such as right-of-way. Right-of-way at this stage in the process would have a very large contingency because we don't know the exact right-of-way impacts and the cost. We have a good basis for that from the alternative analysis. Your at-grade track and signal systems, again, have a larger contingency, and as this project moves forward into final design, those contingency amounts are expected to be reduced as those numbers become more refined. So once you have all those line item contingencies, it's also appropriate at this stage to have an overall program contingency, and that's the number you see to the far right in that table of 12%. So that's the what-ifs that would be associated with the entire project. When all that is said and done, a total project cost in 2011 dollars is estimated to be $1.68 billion for the light rail system. Looking back at what the AA and what the graph that you see before you, this was that low end and high range that the AA produced looking at similar systems across the nation. We've updated this graph using that $1.68 billion on a line item cost. And what is also included in what we've worked with Ernst & Young, and we'll explain more about this in just a minute, this also includes a financial cost associated with the light rail system. The cost of borrowing or the money associated not only with the actual construction of the system, but into an overall per mile cost. So as you can see, the proposed Pinellas light rail system fits very well in line with similar systems that have recently been constructed or very similar in size and scope to the Pinellas system. As I mentioned, we've also engaged Ernst & Young as a part of this, that will speed on their system. And we have Ralph Bannister and Nick Sirianni with Ernst & Young to talk a little bit more about the financial model. And once we developed our capital cost component, what is the most appropriate year to put those costs in, and again, understand the financial capabilities of PSTA and the proposal for light rail and bus transit as well.
Thank you, Ben. Board members, Nick Sirianni with Ernst & Young, and with me today is Rob Bannister as well. We had been given a two-phase scope. The first part of our scope, which we're in the process of conducting now, was to develop a PSTA-specific financial model that allowed us to test the financial feasibility of the overall program, including the expanded bus program and the LRT system. The second part of our scope will be to take a look at whether or not a public-private partnership approach to procuring and long-term operations and maintenance of the LRT would have any benefit to the agency. HNTV, you just heard from Ben Walker. They were scoped to review cost estimates, and they will continue to do that. And then a third consultant, TMD, has done the same type of review on cost estimates related to the bus program. A little bit about our group. Formerly Jeff Parker Associates, we were acquired by Ernst & Young a little over a year ago. We currently are advising public sector clients on over $18 billion in U.S. infrastructure projects across the country. Our expertise includes financial planning and feasibility analysis for various modes of transportation, highways, primarily toll roads. We do a lot of work with transit agencies similar to PSTA, and we're also involved in major intermodal centers. Miami Intermodal Center, for example, is one that we've been involved with FDOT for quite a number of years. We have experience with innovative finance strategies, federal TIFIA loans, for example, and Rob Bannister will talk about how we've incorporated that into the overall debt structure for your program. State infrastructure bank loans, we help clients capture that type of financing on a number of projects here in Florida. We also have experience with the FTA New Starts process because, at least for the LRT, the plan right now assumes that PSTA will pursue FTA New Starts participation to help fund part of the capital cost for the LRT system. And then we also have public-private partnership experience. We helped FDOT close the only 2 P3 projects in the state of Florida, Port of Miami Tunnel, the I-595 Express Lanes project in Fort Lauderdale, both of which are set to open to traffic actually next year, 2014. Our current transit clients include Washington, D.C., Department of Transportation, 37-mile streetcar system. We've been the advisors for CATS, the Charlotte, North Carolina system, for a number of years, probably 20. So we've been helping them with their program for the long term. We're involved in multiple Florida transit projects as well. We're the advisors to FDOT on the Sunrail project in Orlando. We're also involved in Southeast Florida, the introduction of passenger rail service on the Florida East Coast Railroad corridor. And we were just recently awarded through Miami-Dade County MPO an advisory role on revisiting the Bay Lake project in Miami, light rail system that will connect downtown Miami with Miami Beach. As Brad mentioned earlier, what we did was, in the first part of our scope, essentially build upon the conceptual financial plan that was done as part of the alternatives analysis. By developing a system-wide financial model, it allows us to sort of dig deeper into the details of financial feasibility. We can look at annual cash flow analysis, both revenues and costs. We have converted cost estimates to year of expenditure dollars when the cost will actually be incurred. We have the ability to look at different growth rates on the revenue side, sales tax revenue, as well as cost escalation. We revisited all the funding assumptions that were embodied in the conceptual plan, both federal and state funding sources. We have the ability to look at debt service coverage ratio because we are recommending that at least part of the program be debt financed. And we also, at this point, believe that your operating reserve account ought to be expanded. And Rob will talk about a few other recommendations that we have for you on reserve account capability going forward. We're in the process of doing sensitivity testing and analysis, and we'll have the results of that probably the next time we talk to you, and Rob will kind of identify what those sensitivities are that we're currently looking at. With that, I want to turn it over to my associate, Rob Bannister.
Good morning.
Morning.
The next few charts will try to give you a sense of the scale of the capital costs versus the operating costs between each other and among the LRT program and the bus program. This first chart on the capital costs, the bars represent the annual expenditures, and they're color-coded. If you look at the bars shaded in green, the light green bars are the initial capital investments in the bus program, and the dark green bars relate to vehicle replacements. So you'll see initially there's expenditures in the 2016, 2017, 18 period as the bus program ramps up, and then in later years you see costs associated with largely with the replacement of the buses every 12 years or so. The black bars refer to the light rail system, the initial construction of the system, and you'll see that there are 7 years of capital cost payouts. In the final year, in 2024, we're assuming that the operations would commence in that same year, and there would be some residual payments related to the capital costs. So 2024, we're anticipating to be the first operating year. And then out in 2037, we're also forecasting the need for mid-life vehicle overhauls. So again, we're looking at not only initial construction, but also ongoing capital renewal and replacements. This chart shows what the impact is of financing. So we're not assuming any financing for the bus program. We're assuming those costs are paid for on a pay-as-you-go basis. But for the light rail system, we're assuming that the share, the local share, in other words, non-federal, non-state share of the capital costs are financed. So those are smoothed out and spread out over time through debt service payments. We're assuming some bond debt, tax-exempt bond debt that would be senior, and a federal TIFIA loan, which would be subordinate. And those payments are all reflected in these black bars. Now this chart gives a different view of the relative scale of the bus program versus the light rail program. In the capital side, we saw that light rail, those black bars were quite large in comparison to the bus program. And here we see that the black bars are smaller compared to the gray bars. The black bars would be the cost to operate and maintain the light rail system, and the gray bars represent the cost to operate and maintain the bus system. So it's a different picture. The next few slides, I want to review some of the key assumptions that we're currently making. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking at a 6-year construction period with payouts over 7 years, 2018 through 2024. As Ben mentioned, the capital cost in 2011 dollars is $1.68 billion, and we have escalated those costs to the year we expect the cost to be incurred, with escalation rates that range from 2.9% to 4%, to be consistent with the guidance in the Florida DOT work program instructions, and they also are consistent with other transit projects that we work on. I'll skip down here to the escalation rate for the O&M costs. We're assuming 3.25%. On the revenue side, I'll go back up to this third row here. For FTA formula funds, these are funds that are important to transit systems around the country that are received during the operating period. So I'm not talking about initial federal grants for construction, but instead to help keep transit systems in a state of good repair. And we're assuming that given the current state of affairs on the federal level, that there is no growth in that program. The FTA formula funds through 2019, we're assuming it stays at the current levels, and then in 2020, we are forecasting that the growth rate would bump up to 2% a year, which is approximately half of what we've seen over the historical period of the last, if we went back about 15 years or so. If we look at escalation of state grants along the third row from the bottom here, we looked at the Florida DOT work program and what they're anticipating the funding levels to be for the next 5 years, and the annual growth rate comes out to about 1.7%. So that's what we've assumed going forward on the state revenue side. Of course, the largest source of revenue would be the sales tax revenue. We're assuming that collections would not commence until January 1st, 2016. So we're also assuming that the ad valorem revenue would end September 30th, 2015, so at the end of fiscal year 2015. That means that there would be the final quarter of calendar year 2015 where there would be no ad valorem revenue coming into PSTA before the sales tax collections commence January 1st, 2016. So there's a 3-month gap there in revenue. We also are modeling an additional 2-month gap in the sales tax revenues, because we're assuming that while the collections would begin January 1st, 2016, that cash wouldn't begin arriving at PSTA until March of 2016. So we anticipated a delay there to ensure that PSTA has sufficient cash on hand to pay the bills. For the growth rate, the annual growth rate in the sales tax revenues, the model is assuming an average annual rate of 3% per year. And this next slide helps explain how we arrived at that assumption. It's the historic performance of the sales tax going back about 20 years, 1992, and you'll see that the average annual growth rate has been 3.1%. Of course, there's a lot of volatility from year to year. You can see the effects of the recession in 2002 and the Great Recession. So our 3% average annual growth rate is just under what the historical growth rate has been. We're also modeling reserves. There's a revenue stabilization reserve fund that we would recommend be established to respond to the prior chart, the volatility of the sales tax revenue. We know that some years will be greater than our average annual assumption of 3%, some years will be below. So we would suggest that a revenue stabilization fund be established to which excess sales tax revenues would be deposited in years when the sales tax is performing well. It would be a resource from which PSTA could draw during years when the sales tax is below 3%. We would like to set a cap on that, just in case we have a period like in the 90s where we have several years of positive growth. We also have modeled in an operating expense reserve fund set at 3 months of operating expenses, and that's modeled in as the cost of the program. And finally, for the debt service, the lenders, whether they're bond lenders or the federal government, will typically require that a debt service reserve fund be established, and we've modeled the cost of that in our model as well. This slide is summarizing sources and uses of funds for 2 of the principal capital programs. I'll start with the LRT, since all eyes are probably going there first. Ben mentioned that in addition to the strictly capital costs of the LRT program, the $1.68 billion, which escalated tier of expenditure dollars would be approximately $2.3 billion. There would also be finance-related costs, for example, interest during the construction period, costs of issuing the debt, initial deposits to the debt service reserve, and that would bring the total cost in year of expenditure dollars to about $2.6 billion. To fund that, we looked at three sources: federal, state, and local. Federal New Starts grants we're assuming would cover just over a third of the cost. In the past, that program could fund up to 80% of the capital cost, but more recently we have a cap in effect of about 50% of the capital cost. Given that this is an expensive project, we were also weighing that with the dollar amount that 50% would correspond to. Would be half of 2.6 billion would be 1.3 billion, and we look to lower the percentage to just under $1 billion at 938 million. We thought that would be a more realistic target to have in our financial planning. On the state side, the State New Starts Transit Program is able to fund up to 50% of the non-federal share. So if we have a federal share of 36%, the non-federal share would be 64%, so the state could cover up to 32%. However, we wanted to look at what that translated into in dollars and saw that what is in the work program, the state work program for that program, really it might be aggressive to assume a full 32%. And we thought 300 million was a more realistic target given what's in our work program and the demands on that program from other transit systems in the state. So the difference would be the local share funded by PSTA at approximately $1.4 billion. That would be largely funded with proceeds from debt, both the senior and the particular one I mentioned earlier. The BRT program, we're assuming that's paid for on a pay-as-you-go basis, and we assume that the state could fund up to 25% of that, and that would be from different grants that the state has outside the New Starts program. So that would be the local share of 111 million out of a total of almost 150 million. So this chart here, I'll go through this a little slowly because it conveys a lot of different information. There are two shaded areas, the black and the gray. The black corresponds to the light rail program, and it represents the net cost of the program. So we looked at all the costs, not only the capital costs, but also the operating costs, capital renewal and replacement costs, and then we subtracted from that the revenue coming from the federal and state partners, as well as system-generated revenue, such as fare box revenue or any advertising revenue. So what you see in black is the net cost that PSTA needs to fund. You can see that it doesn't begin until 2024, which is when the operating costs commence. That's when we anticipate operations would start, and also when the debt service payments begin from the federal and particular loans. It bumps up a little bit in 2038 or so. That's when the mid-life vehicle overhauls would kick in, that we also assume would be funded with debt. And then towards the end of the projection period, you're starting to see the effects of the retirement of that debt, and all you're left with is the operating costs. So that's relatively smooth in comparison to the bus program, which is represented by the gray. These two shaded areas do not overlap, they're cumulative. The most prominent feature of the gray shaded area are the peaks that you see in a pattern, and again that represents every 12 years when the buses need to be replaced. So you have an initial build out of or expansion of the bus program in the early years of the sales tax collections, and then every 12 years or so you see a peak. The black line represents your tax receipts, both ad valorem and sales tax revenue. So in the first couple of years, fiscal years 2014 and 15, that's still your ad valorem revenue. And then it begins to increase in 2016. Again, we're assuming you've got only 7 months of sales tax collections in 2016 because of that 5-month delay I mentioned earlier. And then it grows thereafter at the 3% growth rate. So what you'll see here is that in some years, the revenues, the tax receipts exceed the total cost of both your bus and your light rail program. And in other years, particularly when you've got this bus replacement cycle, your costs exceed the revenues. So if I move to the next slide, that translates into a cash balance that goes up and down. It's going up in this period of the early 2020s, and I'll jump back to the previous slide. That corresponds to this white area under the tax receipts line. So you've got buildup of cash reserves here because your costs are below your revenues. And then you have your cash balances decreasing as you go through periods when your costs are exceeding your revenues. So what you can see here is that while there's variation in the cash balances, they go up and down. The cash balances are above zero, and after the debt is repaid out in the 2040s on the light rail system, you can see that it really takes off the cash balance. Nick will summarize for you some of the additional scenarios that we've tested.
Yeah, even though the picture looks reasonably good in terms of the overall program's financial feasibility, I mean, there are certain risks that all of us collectively will have to keep in mind and monitor as we go forward. We can't predict with any certainty what the economy is going to do, so we can always have higher inflation that we're trying to deal with. We could have sales tax revenue shocks like we had with recent recession. We could just have slower sales tax growth than we're assuming. Instead of 3%, 2.5%, or whatever the number might be. Same with ridership and utilization of the system. We could have lower fare box revenue accruing to help offset operating costs. Even though HNTB and TMD are doing a good job of looking at the cost estimates at this point, by the time those expenditures are to be made, we could have higher costs that we're dealing with for any number of reasons. And then Rob mentioned the FTA New Starts assumption. Even though we're only assuming roughly a 36% participation rate from FTA, it's still a significant number, close to $1 billion. So that's several years out, and we'll all have the ability to monitor competition associated with the program, as well as whether or not Congress decides to grow the program sooner than what we've assumed. What can you do as an agency if you have to mitigate some of those risks? This is a list of just selected items, but obviously you can look for opportunities to reduce cost in both the bus program as well as the LRT program. On the bus side, you can look at alternative fuel vehicles, which may save money at least on the front end on the acquisition side, but that's something that would need more study in terms of whether the costs are higher or lower on the operating side. And then you can always refine the ramp up of the bus service or bus program expansion, perhaps a slower ramp up than what we currently assume. With the LRT system, these are not so much specific to just this project, but these are strategies that other transit agencies have used in the context of new rail starts. Right-of-way donations from private landholders along the alignment, there might be opportunities there. In some cities, those jurisdictions that have stations are willing to make a contribution either on the construction side for the station or help with ongoing station operation and maintenance costs. Likewise, municipalities or cities along the alignment, there's opportunities there to create community redevelopment districts, as they're referred to here in Florida. They could capture the tax increment revenue growth without altering the actual tax rate. That could be a source of a local funding contribution for the project. There might be, even though we were conservative with our assumption on state New Start's funding participation, looking at the projections that FDOT has on record today about how they want to grow that program, there could be opportunities to capture more than $300 million by the time we get to that point in time. We'll look at opportunities to phase the LRT, although we've looked preliminarily at some of those now, and it doesn't really make a material difference because you're fighting, if you delay a second phase, for example, then you're dealing with cost inflation. So there's an offset to trying to build it in pieces, if you will. And then the second part of our overall scope is to look at a public-private partnership to see if that would assist with controlling costs over the long term. That is one of the advantages of going that route, that you have the ability to lock in a long-term cost structure for the life of a concession. And typically they're 30 to 35 years. So going forward, we're not finished today, we're not finished a month from now. You'll want to keep sort of monitoring things as you get closer to when real money is needing to be committed. We've assumed 3.25% in terms of O&M cost inflation for both the bus and rail programs. So that'll take management on the part of the agency to manage cost growth. And then, as Rob mentioned, consideration of certain policies. You want to consider putting those in place, like setting up the reserve fund capabilities. And that concludes our presentation, and we're obviously available for any questions.
Cassandra Borchers, PSTA staff. I do have some slides about the implementation strategy of how these projects would come online over the next 10 years, but at the pleasure of the board, this is a lot of information to take in, and if you'd like to talk about the financial strategy first before we get to that implementation strategy, we can do that perhaps starting with the planning committee and their comments, because they did see this at their meeting.
We have a couple questions. Let's do that, and we will begin with the planning committee.
Okay, I'm going to refer to Bill because I was absent from that meeting. I did see this presentation at ACPT, but I was not privy to the planning committee's comments, so I'll refer to them.
Well, and we did not have the benefit of the consultants actually in the room, so Brad did an excellent job of going through it. And I would refer to the other members of the planning committee if they had specific questions that they had wanted to bring forward from that meeting. I did have a couple, and let me ask them to get started. When would you start, recommend that the 3-month operating reserve be established and moving forward with that? Would that be immediately or at the time the light rail becomes operational, or how do you face that?
Currently, it's funded at 2 months of operating expenses, and we have that gradually build up to the 3 months by the time the light rail system becomes operational.
So it would be phased in over that period.
Right.
And what were your, I don't recall, expectations on fare box revenue growth?
Well, it
What were your
differs.
assumptions there?
Right, we have average fare calculations, and the fare box recovery ratio differs for the bus program and the light rail program because the costs differ, but it ranges between approximately 20% and I would say the upper 30s. It varies over time. And I think that's consistent with what we see in other transit systems in areas similar to elsewhere.
The light rail being higher than the bus? Or you just aggregated them all together?
Our projections are showing the light rail is lower than the bus this time.
Fare box recovery ratio usually fluctuate over a period of time. It depends on how long that your route has been in place. So when you first put new service out on the road, your fare box recovery is lower, and as that service matures, so does the ridership, and your fare box recovery increases. So it's not just a stable fare box recovery for the mode type. It is based on when the service comes online.
And I'll refer to any other comments from the planning committee.
Good question. Looking at your chart on the base case program financial feasibility, which has got the ups and downs of how the money comes in and so forth. Is that the basis for your reserve recommendation?
That's a good question. I neglected to point out earlier. The cost of making deposits to the operating reserve is reflected in these shaded areas. And as well as the debt service reserve. So those costs are built in here, and the cash balance chart, this is your cash balance that is separate from the balances that are being held in reserve for your debt service reserve and your operating expense reserve. So those are separate accounts. So this cash balance is after you've made deposits to those separate reserves.
And in the reserve stabilization, or revenue stabilization reserve fund, we're setting aside 3% when it's good years and taking it out when it's bad. It's possible that we have a long series of good years and build up a sizable amount, which naturally people would like to access. Is there some sort of recommendation of the maximum amounts of what those reserves would have to be so that we wouldn't be tempted to take it out too soon, but we'd have an idea of what is prudent to do?
Right, and that's a great observation, because if you have a long stretch like we did in the 90s of sales tax growth rates that exceeded 3%, those balances get quite large. So we would recommend setting a cap on that reserve, and probably based on looking at your operating expenses going forward, but we haven't settled on a recommendation yet, but that will be part of our recommendation. And in the stress case scenarios that we'll be running and sharing the results with you, we'll be showing you what those that revenue stabilization fund, those balances look like, because in this model scenario, we're assuming that the 3% average annual growth rate occurs year in and year out, so there's neither deposits nor withdrawals from the reserve, and therefore there are no balances. But we'll go into that reserve in more detail the next time.
And then finally, on your, on this surge of capital cost for bus replacement, is there an assumption of how many buses you would be replacing at the same time?
I don't know those off the top of my head, but certainly we received numbers of buses that would be replaced on a schedule and broken down by 40-foot buses versus 30-foot buses, articulated versus standard. And Cassandra Cobb is more familiar with those details, but the bus consultant provided us those.
And I guess it'd be one question before, how do we provide for that replacement? Because at this point, we're just replacing them little by little, and we have to cover the
That's why you see the spikes in Rob's chart of the bus replacements, is because when we advanced the bus program in the early years, we would be buying a lot of buses all at once, and that's why you see those spikes. So one of the things that we could do is if we bought those buses more slowly, then those spikes would also fall as we start to replace the buses. And so the portion, the white portion of the graph under the black line is where you could either set up a bus fund reserve, again, another reserve to hold off and allow for dollars to accommodate those spikes, or again, you space out your implementation in order to accommodate.
Are those reserves part of the reserve?
That would be something complete. That would be something that we haven't discussed as the list of reserve funds specifically, because we want to make sure that the financial plan and the implementation strategy fall in line first, and then those are the things that we can do as a secondary step. Again, this is the base case scenario of what you're trying to do, and the reserves that Nick and Rob have recommended are based on weathering the economic storms rather than your implementation strategy. So I asked them to keep this the way it is so that you could see what was actually happening with the bus program.
So then there isn't any provision for the capital funds that are going to be necessary to replace those buses.
So there is, because you have surpluses in that late teen, early 20 years.
So basically, you have, in the cash balance you see in the early 2020s, it's spiking up. And then as you get to the bus replacement cycle in the early 2030s, and then 12 years later in the early 2040s, that cash balance goes down. But what we could do is moderate the peaks and the troughs in this cash balance by, as Cassandra said, siphoning off some of that excess cash balance and putting it in a separate capital replacement reserve. And that would be reflected in the net cost of the bus program, which would eliminate some of the excess, and then it would reduce the deficit because you could withdraw from that fund.
So we're definitely planning for the cost of replacement the bus.
Yes, and it's inherent in the cash balances. We just haven't displayed it as a separate capital replacement reserve.
So when you see the budget year after year, it would be completely balanced.
Excellent presentation, lots of detail. I have a couple of questions on slides 38 through 41 and 47 through 53. Specifically on 39 and 40, it looks as if the updated system comparison cost at 80.3. Looking at slide 39, you see that there was obviously a variation between the low end and the high end in the estimates back in 2011. Wondering that the 80.3 number, approximately 10% higher than the high end, does that include this unallocated contingency of approximately 10%?
That includes that financial cost that Rob was talking about of the cost of borrowing and the interest associated with that. So the high end that you see here of 72 million, that's the high end of that 1.7 billion cost that Jacobs produced. Our numbers were 1.68, so it's right at that limit. But when you include that cost of borrowing, that's the additional 8 million per mile that you see here to get to the 80.3 number. So this number actually incorporates the financial component associated with the project as well. And the other projects that you see in blue here also incorporate the cost of borrowing for the FTA tax sheets with the FTA programs.
So that 80 number will represent borrowing and this contingency as well. So there is some overhead built into that specific number.
Correct.
On slide 41, under the two-phase EYIA scope, there was some reference to public-private partnerships. Specifically, it appears here to the light rail system. Has there been some possibility for public-private partnerships also on the bus system?
You know, there could be, but we thought we would start by looking at the LRT because that's kind of a defined standalone versus if we were to look at the bus program, we'd have to decide how much of the program would be amenable to a P3. So we haven't looked at that in detail, but we can at least consider it whenever we begin the second phase of our scope.
The question on slide 47. One thing that I find that's obviously very important, and you touched upon it nicely, is the estimation of the operation and maintenance costs. And slide 57 pretty much shows the 3.25% evenly applied to both the light rail and the bus. And I guess my initial question that would come out of that is, whereas I can understand the operation costs being similar for both, what were the analysis, or what did you use for looking at the maintenance costs, basically, of two somewhat different technologies being basically, sharing the same operation and maintenance costs?
Well, that's actually part of the second part of our scope. We really want to focus on the capital aspect first, and now we'll be coming back from the light rail component, looking at the very detailed O&M costs associated with light rail as well. And
there's also things that we've considered are capitalized maintenance. So things like the mid-life overhaul of the vehicles, which are considered a maintenance activity, are capitalized in a way and put into the capital cost because of the equipment that they use and the number of parts that they put into that kind of work. That's also something that is capitalized maintenance is also something, or preventative maintenance is also something that we can use federal dollars for. And so there is a little separation between in maintenance of deciding whether it becomes an operational cost or a capital cost. And so we've accounted for that in there. So there is that element that is taken out of the railroad.
And you're using buses, obviously the previous experience that you have on buses here, but then also going for light rail, going to other locations that you guys have worked on and using that prior experience for your estimates of your light rail.
correct.
I would say that, just so you know, our incremental cost of bus escalation has been slightly over 1%. So we are being very conservative on this particular item.
And the last set is like on slide 53. It's interesting when you look out the out years, like in 2046, and you look at the several plots before, you can see that at that point the debt is being retired and it looks like costs are going down, so you've got this upward curve on there. But if you ignored that and you consider the areas under the curve and the areas above the curve, it looks as if you don't include what's going on past 2046, that your overall estimates is that there would be more, an overall plus, more, your cash balance in the areas above the curve are more than what would be below the curve, so you're looking at a net plus.
Well,
I should have been a little clearer on this slide because there is a difference between this slide. Your characterization was more consistent with this slide in terms of costs being above or below the revenue line. On this slide, the dotted line actually is your operating balance, which is really a net cash flow. It's your operating revenues plus your sales taxes minus your operating expenses. So that's just there for comparative purposes, whereas the solid black line is your accumulated cash balance. So here it's not so much a scenario of being above or below the line, but they're just, the dotted line's just there for reference.
And the dotted line, the relative position of the dotted line is heavily caused by your estimate of your operation and maintenance benefit.
Correct, as well as the sales tax revenue.
I think one of the indicators here is that you want that cash balance to be above zero in any given year.
Very nice, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Duff.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, just a quick question. I have the benefit of seeing this presentation before the ACPT, so I have a question and then some comments. My question is not about specifically this report, but about your doing these analysis for others. And can you speak to the analysis that you've done for others and who might actually be following it and what that success rate has been?
A couple of the transit systems that we analyzed include the Charlotte area transit system. I personally have been working with them since 2005, and the Jeffrey Mark Associates prior to that. I'm also on the consultant team that reviews the Denver Regional Transit District's financial plan on behalf of the MPO, so we do an annual financial review. We thought those systems were comparable because they're funded with a transit dedicated sales tax and they have a combination of bus and rail. For Charlotte, I can tell you that, as we tried to indicate earlier, this is a marathon, not a sprint, and it's a dynamic financial model that inputs should constantly be revisited as new information becomes available. And that's exactly what we've done with Charlotte from the time that we worked on the full funding grant agreement from the FTA back in 2005 for their initial light rail line through last year when the FTA awarded full funding grant agreement for the extension of that light rail system. And I can tell you that it was difficult preparing the finance plan last year because of the Great Recession. The sales tax revenues in Charlotte plummeted. There was double-digit negative growth year on year, such that their sales tax revenues have just returned to the dollar level that they were back in around 2005, 2006. That's basically a permanent removal of the revenue in the sense that their revenue curve has notched down, even if the growth rate remains the same. And back when Charlotte was preparing its 2030 system plan in 2006, the expectation was that the sales tax revenue would be much higher and that there would be more funds available. So it's a finance plan that we had to revisit, and there were some hard decisions that needed to be made about deferring capital projects and phasing in, scaling back the size of the light rail extension when the stations was eliminated. So it's a financial model that has to constantly be reevaluated, and that would be our recommendation here, that you not just look at static results we present next month, but that you can continuously revisit that as a planning tool.
And that model you will be providing to us that we can adjust the various inputs to that, to be looking at it. So it's not something we have to come back to you from a year-to-year standpoint.
Correct, and that's exactly the idea we had in mind when we constructed the model, was to make it user-friendly, not a black box where you're relying on us to run the model, and Brad has already given us direction that before the end of our engagement, he would like us to conduct a training session with PSTA staff to ensure that they feel comfortable with how they would manipulate inputs and conduct sensitivity analysis. So, of course, we'd be available, but we're hoping that it's built in a way that you can be self-reliant.
And the Charlotte situation too, they went into their sales tax situation a number of years prior to bringing you in, correct?
It's a good question. I believe the sales tax went into effect in 1999. I know that Jeffrey Parker Associates was involved in the early 2000s in projecting the long-term cash flows.
But my point is that we're doing this before. We're trying to understand, are the assumptions in all the various studies, are they good assumptions? Not that they were bad, but maybe they were more general. We want them more detailed. We're trying to look at future dollars. We're trying to look at, is it sustainable? And we're trying to have confidence on the behalf of the public dollar. And so we're doing this before we go and ask the public for money, whereas in Charlotte's situation, they did it after. And they did have some stumbling blocks, not all to their fault per se, but they didn't account for big swings up and down in the economy. And they did follow averages, if you will, where we're trying to look at more detailed and realistic information to make a business plan like any other person would do.
Correct. And we're applying these lessons learned to the Charlotte experience as well as what we learned in Denver and other transit systems.
Charlotte was at a completely different place in their planning as well. Charlotte did not do any corridor studies, so no alternatives analysis on any corridor was completed before the referendum was passed. So again, they did it at a systems planning level and then went to the corridor level. So again, it's a completely different scenario that we have definitely learned from.
So, and then the other thing, I'm just going to make a comment, but I would like you to just make sure I'm saying it correctly. Our original assumptions through all the various plans, some of those things have changed and been refined after your initial review. You have more review and more details to look at. But I think if I'm correct, you know, our original intended implementation of the light rail was around 2020, and it's now moved out to 23, 24 to allow for buildup of reserves and a more realistic approach in making sure everything is sustainable. That's correct, right? We made a reduction in what our original anticipation of state and federal grant contributions. We've reduced both of those things based on their actual trend of what they've been giving and how much money they actually have, and knowing that it's a volatile situation, so we're relying less on their grant funding, which again also moves some projects out. We've put costs into the year of expenditure instead of the 2011 costs that were in the assumptions that we were using. So, of course, that increases our annual operating cost, as you showed us. So that's a more realistic funding model. Am I missing anything that I saw a big picture? Is that about it? Those are the big changes, right, of our assumptions that we had before. I'm sure there are a lot of little ones. I'm just looking big picture. Is that about it?
I think those are the pretty big ones, yeah.
Okay. And that's good. Those are all good things. You know, I'm hoping, and I think my fellow board members feel the same, that we want to be responsible and make a responsible, sustainable, achievable plan to how to implement this before we go out to the public and ask them to fund it.
Every advancement we make makes our numbers more accurate, and what we find when we do that and dig a little deeper is that we're being very consistent in our numbers as well. So I think we were sufficiently conservative from the very start, and we're finding that those conservative actions at the start are paying off now as we improve the accuracy.
Well, and then just a final statement is that you know this, but you're not really thinking about it, is that the fact that the sales tax, the only way it can get raised is a referendum, unlike the millage rate. So if you're sitting on a city council or even PSTA board right now, you can raise the millage rate if you get desperate for money. Well, that's not the case for the sales tax. You gotta go back out to referendum, and that's not a pretty sight. So you have to be able to accomplish what you can within the funding that you get. So it's important that we do this. And I look forward to the future, the public-private partnership and the other next steps. When will that be completed?
November 20th.
Okay. Great, thanks.
Thank you. Councilman Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good presentation. First time I saw it, a lot of detail. My reservations go right to the slide you have on reserves. I think it's page 50 or slide 50. And it's kind of piggybacking on some of the concerns she had. Knowing what you know about what happened in Charlotte as it pertains to having the 1% from the sales tax, and the way the sales tax, it goes up and down. Is 3%, is that conservative? Is that enough for reserve? And I'll tell you why I asked that, because we're swapping an Avalon source for the sales tax. So we'll have to make it do with what we have. But I'm just curious, is that going to be enough? And you say yes, some deep swings, so I'm just wondering, is that being conservative, 3%?
Well, the 3% growth, you mentioned Charlotte, they had 3.5%. That's what their current assumption is for their average annual growth rate. And they have, their historical performance is much wider swings than we've experienced in Pinellas County. So we're assuming a growth rate that's 3%, which is lower than Charlotte's 3.5%. It's lower than the historical rate here. And the swings around the 3% are not as wide as they are in Charlotte. I do believe that having the reserve at that level will be helpful. That's not something that Charlotte has had in the past. That's something that was just recommended in the spring when the City Finance Department was looking at seeking financing for the Blue Line extension. So that's something new to Charlotte as well, and it's something that we're recommending that we start from the get-go here before the sales tax is implemented. I think that what we'll be revealing is when we do the stress-based analysis that looks at the timing of those swings around the 3%. Because if you have, if you set a cap on the fund balance at an appropriate level, and your sales tax, when you start filling that reserve, your sales tax is exceeding the 3% growth rate, then you've got time to build up the reserve and reach the appropriate balance. Whereas we're going to look at that scenario as well as, well, what if your first year or two of collections you have a recession and there's no money available to deposit to the reserve? How would that reverberate in the future? So,
because I know the first few years there won't be any Avalon coming in once we do the switch, and we'll be operating off reserve, which like this board has been doing for the longest, even through the recession, responsibly. So having a lot of Avalon increases, but we're almost at our max for revenue from the Avalon source. So I'm just curious, is that was the 3% going to be enough? And with the anecdotal data that you have, because of all the other transit systems that are up and running, I was just wondering what the 3% level or not. But I trust that. Also, I wanted to comment on you mentioned Miami. We did tour their intermodal facility, the tunnel project. And I guess my question goes more or less toward the public-private partnership. I did get a breakdown. They provided me with a breakdown of total dollar amount for the public-private partnership for the tunnel. And I'm just curious as what model would you go off of for the public-private one? It would be something like that.
Yeah, it'll be similar in that we'll look at an availability payment model. Transit doesn't make money, so we would want to look at an annual stream of payments that would be made to a private concessionaire, and depending on how we structure it, those payments could help retire capital debt if we looked at private investment, equity and private debt, as well as pay for any subsidy required on the long-term O&M costs.
Yeah, the one I got from them, they provided for me was very detailed, and it was for the actual tunnel, and it worked perfectly.
Right.
I'm just curious as to what models you're going to be using. Some of them are probably already similar to the one in Miami that are already up and running as pertains to public-private partnerships, which has been the first venture for us.
Another model we would look at is the Denver Regional Transit District. They had the first availability payment concession in the U.S. on the transit system, and it received a full funding grant agreement, federal TIFIA loan for their commuter rail system, as well as a couple other rail lines going to the Denver Union Station downtown. So we'll be looking closely at that. And in addition, Ernst & Young, we work closely with our counterparts in Canada, where there have been several transit availability payment-based concessions, so we'll draw in input from them as well. And then we also look at the experience in Europe, Australia, which are areas that have for many years used public-private partnerships to procure transit systems.
Yeah, I know you mentioned about maybe the donation of right-of-way and stuff like that to help defray some of the costs, but I mean, this is not the first. I think probably one of the last two major municipalities to go through a transit, mass transit, such as light rail. So I know there's other models out there that we can look at, just like we're doing with the assumptions on the financials. But it was a good presentation.
Okay, got a couple more questions, and we do want to get to the rest of the presentations. Commissioner Barclay.
I just wanted to touch very briefly on the concept of reserves. I thought that was an excellent component to your presentation to talk about the fact that we could have some years where things are not in a positive situation, and the reserve element is very critical. It looks like from your chart on 53 that there's a period of about 10 years from 2020 to 2030 where there is fairly positive cash situation. My question is, in the reserve concept that you're talking about, are we factoring in some kind of a rate of return on those positive reserves so that we use that also to offset any unexpected expenses or otherwise pay down debt or otherwise use that money effectively over and above just simply letting money sit in a cash account?
We've been conservative in that regard. We have assumed an interest earnings rate of 1%. It's a little higher than what folks are earning right now, but conservative in the past, even with investments as conservative as treasuries, it's been as high as 4 or 5%. So about 1% is conservative.
So that'll help offset an additional positive reserve element in the event that we do experience negative cash flow along this process.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow-up question on the reserves. You recommended a 3-month operating expenses for the reserve, but also a recommendation for the debt service reserve fund. But there was no recommendation in terms of what that length should be. Would that also be a 3-month, or was that part of the operating expense reserve?
The debt service reserve is calculated differently. The operating expense reserve, as you mentioned, is funded so that the balance equals 3 months worth of your next year's operating budget, whereas the debt service reserve is funded at the time, in the case of the senior bond debt, at the time that you reach financial close on that bond issue, you would fund it. There's a rule about what the minimum balance needs to be, but essentially it's your maximum annual debt service, and we're assuming level debt service payments, so it would be equal to 1 year's worth of annual debt service. And that would be the same way that the TIPIA debt service reserve is funded, except for that can be funded at the end of the construction period.
Thank you.
Okay, Sandra? Oh, one more?
Yeah, I'm just reminded of a conversation I had with somebody on Sunday about chaos theory. And I think it's terrific that we've got everything, all of our assumptions laid out. But I'm just wondering if we made a provision to revisit the assumptions on a regular basis.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Looking at the contingency assumptions, there was a contingency assumption for right-of-way, I think it was 40%. Does that mean that if the original cost estimate for right-of-way, just to use a simple number, is $100 million, that was the best estimate at the present time of right-of-way costs of $100 million, then you'd add another $40 million to that, the 40%?
Correct.
And that is, you do all of that, and that comes up with a number before the unallocated contingency, where you take whatever the amount was in the base and the allocated, and then you add another 12% to that.
Correct. Each line item has its individual contingencies, and that goes into your allocated contingency that you see on the table. So that $40 million that you referenced would be included within that, within that allocated contingency amount. Once the whole program is developed, then we have an unallocated 12%. We actually grew that. The initial Jacobs estimate was 10%. So we thought at this stage, a little bit more conservative growth, 12%, which is what was allocated here.
Okay, and then the other question is, we've seen this in presentation format. Is there some details behind it that people could look at and get down a little farther into the detail?
Oh, Mr. Johnson, if you would like to come to my office and walk through the line-by-line cost estimates, I'd be happy to do that with you.
So that's available to members of the public as well?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.